cheap, unskilled workers, low wages, and long, excruciating 70-hour work weeks. These were the working conditions for many Americans in the late 1800s and even through the early 1900s. So, why is it that we have relatively better working conditions now?
That's because of the creation of labor unions. A labor union is an organized association of workers, often in a trade or profession, formed to protect and further their rights and interests. So because of these labor unions, workers were able to get better working conditions as well as better pay. But there are more questions to ask and more answers to give, so let's address it.
How did working conditions encourage workers to form unions in the late 1800s, and what made it difficult for union workers to create large industrial unions? Well, to answer these questions, let's bring up a bit of background.
As we previously said, the workers often worked for cheap, and they were mostly unskilled in the area they worked. Jobs needed to be done, and factories just didn't have the money to fund proper training. Wages were low, and workers were on their feet for 10 hours straight on average. So clearly things were going wonderfully, except they weren't. Factory workers also faced hazardous work environments. They worked in cramped spaces with poor ventilation, and to make matters worse, they were exposed to toxic fumes for their entire workday.
So, clearly they had plenty of reason to unionize in conditions like these. Low wages were definitely an important factor of unionization. Rent was too high and wages were just too low. There are many factors that remained in the shadows during this time, so here are 5 things you didn't know about labor and labor unions in the late 1800s. Number 1. The children. Clearly, child labor had been mostly, if not completely, banned in the US, but of course, it hasn't always been that way. Back in the late 1800s, children were forced to work in similar conditions as adults. When labor unions were created, they were able to stay home and play as children should, but the law that officially banned child labor hadn't been created until 1938, after labor unions had already started relieving children from work. Women worked longer hours and were paid significantly less than male workers. The reason for longer working hours is so they could bring home more money in a day, enough to help their spouse support their home, or enough so they could survive on their own. And speaking of lower wages, on average, a factory worker made about 20 cents an hour and roughly $600 annually. If we were still being paid this way in today's economy, we'd all be on the streets begging for change nobody has. There are at least 777 people killed by law enforcement between 1850 and 1974. So although the work environments were dangerous, it seemed what people really had to fear was corporate greed, when management hired private organizations to kill striking workers, who were known as strikebreakers. These were people who continued to work despite strikes, or people who were hired to kill striking workers. So, going back to the question, workers decided to unionize when work conditions became too much of a threat to their well-being and livelihood. And due to owners hiring strikebreakers, it was simply too dangerous and difficult to create a large-scale union.
Companies still try to take down unions, such as Starbucks and Walmart, who fire employees for going to unions. New organizations have been created to at least assure that workers' rights are not being violated, such as OSHA, that prevents hazardous workplaces by requiring companies to meet certain aspects. Only 11.3% of the world is represented by a union. This number is only decreasing. There have been nearly 400 labor strikes in the U.S. in 2023, proving that although working conditions have improved, we are still facing many issues. And there are 20 federal laws on unionizing.